The story starts with our protagonist who was locked in a prison cell, opening her eyes and wondering where she was. Immediately thereafter, she noticed that she had handcuffs on her wrists and a collar on her neck, which confirmed to her that she had become a prisoner of war after being defeated by some barbarians. A flashback then begins and takes us to the year 1342 of the Dragon Calendar in the barbaric lands of the East. In that moment, a huge battle was taking place, and a soldier informed our protagonist, who was the leader, that the barbarians had launched a violent counterattack that had destroyed the volunteers. Not to mention that the left-wing vanguard had collapsed. After hearing the report, our protagonist commanded them to stay calm since they still were Ildren's East Expedition Knights. She then organized her troops to perform a tactical withdrawal. Her plan was to retreat while keeping contact with the barbarians. However, she was aware that even if they survived that, they had lost too many men. That was why our protagonist, who was Serafina de la Valiant, first knight commander of the East Expedition Army of the Ildren Kingdom, decided to send as many men as possible back home. Nevertheless, in that moment, a warrior that looked very powerful confronted her and asked her if she was the leader known as Crystal Helmet. Right after, he challenged her to a duel. In that moment, she knew that the best course of action was to fight him in single combat for the others to retreat. She then told her deputy that she was leaving the rest to him and asked him to tell her elder brother that she had given her life for their country. The duel then began, and Serafina lost almost immediately. Even her sword ended up broken. Nevertheless, the warrior was impressed because she had managed to hold out against him, while she thought that he was a monster. Our protagonist then asked him to kill her, but he refused, saying that she would be his spoil of war. He then told her that she should not worry about her life because her body had a good use. Back to the present, she recalled what had happened and began to wonder if she would be treated as a serf and forced to work as a livestock, or if she would be tortured until they got as much information as they could. In any case, she was aware that their intentions were not good, especially considering that she was a woman. In fact, she began also wondered if they would turn her into their plaything, and after imagining that scenario, she got shocked. However, she quickly dismissed those thoughts and began to wonder what had happened to her troops, because she knew that a full withdrawal couldn't have been possible with the amount of time she had bought them. She then began to think that she had failed to fulfill her responsibility as a noble because she had failed her troops and had failed to capture the fertile lands of the East, which meant that the people back home would starve. In that moment, a girl named Cece entered the cell, and Serafina mistook her as a torturer, but Cece quickly clarified that she was only ordered to do one thing, and that was prepare Serafina to her owner's liking. Cece then used the chains to lift and restrain our protagonist so she could do her job with ease, while the warrior thought that it was time for he to visit his spoil of war. In the meantime, Cece had stripped Serafina and was washing her. She then told her that since she had heard that our protagonist had fought against that man, she was expecting a rugged woman, but she was surprisingly pretty. They then began to talk about femininity, but in the end, Cece reminded Serafina that she would never leave those lands again. Afterwards, she finished washing, dressing, and preparing her, while our protagonist got confused because apparently she was not going to be tortured. However, before she could think of anything else, the barbarian warrior arrived and told her that he had barely recognized her. He then introduced himself as Velid the Thunder Voice, heir to the head chief, Urdin the One-Eyed. Nevertheless, Serafina still saw him as a monster, and recalled some stories she had been told about how the barbarians kidnapped female knights to sacrifice them to horrible monsters. She then snapped at him that she would not beg for her life, so he could kill her in any way he preferred. That surprised both Cece and Vel, and then the warrior told her that she had a good name. Right after, he added that he was not going to kill her because he had taken her to be his bride. That astonished Serafina, who didn't believe him and told him that he wanted her to lower her guard for some ritual. After all, they were enemies, and if he wanted her, he could have taken her while she was asleep. Vel then said that they indeed were enemies, but also explained to her that for generations in his family, it was a tradition to have a female knight from the East Expedition Army as a wife. Of course, Serafina was still not convinced, but he twisted her words and reminded her that she had said that he could have her in any way he preferred. He then added that he was not going to force her into his customs, and told her that when they crossed swords he could tell that she was the one for him. It had been love at first sight. He then left, leaving our protagonist completely startled. Shortly after, she reacted and asked what had been all that, and Cece quickly replied that it had been a marriage proposal. Serafina was dreaming about her entire life how her grandfather taught her the way of the sword, how other nobles thought it was preposterous to seat a woman as a lord commander, how the ladies mocked her for not having a husband although she had passed her 20th year. Even her brother didn't take her being a knight seriously. He had told her that she should show some respect to the station of Lord Commander by ending that charade and finding someone respectable who would have her and marry. She then saw Vela asking her to be his bride, and that woke her up. However, the real nightmare began afterward when she realized he was sleeping beside her, but he was not just sleeping beside her. He was naked, and he even had a morning wood. Of course, she went nuts and snapped at him why he was there and why he was naked. Nevertheless, Vela didn't bat an eyelid and replied that he didn't really see a problem with sleeping in his own room. That revelation made her speechless, but she quickly regained her senses and snapped at him why she was in his bedroom. He then began to talk to her about what had happened the night before, and she again misunderstood everything and thought that they had made love. And to add insult to injury, Vel, instead of explaining things to her properly, he just played around and teased her by confirming that they had indeed made love. That pissed her off big time because he was treating a maiden's chastity as a triviality. But right after she began to panic because she had started to consider the possibility of having gotten pregnant, and what made things worse was that she couldn't remember anything. She even thought that her fate would be to multiply their enemies and immediately thereafter demanded him to kill her. Obviously, Vela refused and told her that he didn't understand why she was so eager to die. She then explained that she had already borne the shame of a loss in the battlefield, so she would not stoop to the likes of attacking an unarmed opponent in a rage because her pride was the one thing she couldn't cast aside. That was why before she lost all honor left to her, she begged him to quickly kill her. Vel then asked her if it was really that bad to make love and to have a baby to the point of begging to be killed. To which she replied that shame and honor might mean nothing to a barbarian scum like him, but pride was everything for a noble. In that moment, Sissy arrived, and to make things short, she clarified everything. The night before, they had given Seraphina a sleep potion, but they had messed up with the dose and that made her puke and lose consciousness. Obviously, that meant that nothing had happened between her and Vel. After realizing that, she again went nuts and snapped at him that he had slept naked beside her to toy with her, which was inexcusable. She even asked him to give her her sword so she could cut him to shreds. However, he just laughed out loud and told her that it seemed she had recovered nicely. He then added that they had prepared a morning meal for her since it had been a full day since the battle and she hadn't eaten a thing, so he would wait for her in the sitting room. He then left and she began to wonder what was all that. She had steeled her will towards dying in the battlefield, but she had never imagined she would be taken captive. That was why she was still digesting the huge relief she had felt after confirming that she was still virgin. She then began to consider their customs and concluded that perhaps they made wives of their enemies to ensure the strength of future generations. But above all, she had pursued knighthood, blade in hand, for 10 years, so it was really confusing being desired as a woman. However, she quickly dismissed that thought and told to herself that he was a barbarian and she was his prisoner, nothing more. She even began to consider that perhaps they were going to torture her with the so-called morning meal, but they were about to be surprised because she was well acquainted with even the lowliest of field rations. Nevertheless, when she arrived to the sitting room, she realized that there was meat, and that shocked her because in her homeland only the military class in need of strong bodies was allowed the privilege of meat. After all, the kingdom of Ildren was characterized by its desolate atmosphere and lean land. That was why even her as a daughter of a noble was no exception. Afterward, she thought that their plan was to eat that huge amount of fat meat in front of her in order to break her. However, when she was in the middle of a speech saying that she was not going to fall for that trap, Velis interrupted her and offered her a big piece of meat. She just couldn't believe that he had done that, since the piece of meat was bigger than her torso, so she told them that they were trying to use extravagance to soften her warrior's resolve since they planned to tame her as an animal. She then screamed that she would rather starve to death than accept barbarian charity. Sadly, her stomach disagreed with her, and after realizing what it had done, she asked Vela to kill her, to which he asked if that would be a running thing with her. He then told her that if she chose not to eat, she was just lying to herself and it would accomplish nothing. He also added that they took lives in order to live, not as some game. In that moment, Stacey got closer to her and whispered that the day before, after he took her there, he had gone hunting alone so she might have a feast waiting for her when she awakened. She also explained that when a son of the chieftain went hunting alone as a welcome, it was a sort of ritual, a way to express gratitude towards someone they hoped to make their wife. However, Seraphina was not touched after hearing that, and asked what it had to do with her. But Stacey countered her by saying that Vela was the equivalent of royalty in her land. In fact, he would be a prince. So if she was a noble, it would be considered rude to reject his hospitality. That surprised her because she hadn't expected her to know their etiquette that well. But then she realized that they had been in the habit of capturing female knights for some time. In the end, she accepted the meat, and when she began to eat it, she couldn't help but to fall in love with such a luxurious meal. Shortly after, Seraphina told him that she still took issue with him desiring to take her as a bride, but the business with the sleep potion was water under the bridge. She then asked him what sort of meat was that, to which he replied that she was eating dragon's meat, and that astonished her because in her land, dragons were legends. Seraphina couldn't believe that she was allowed to go out, but Veli told her that he was thinking about showing her the mountains out back. However, she replied that she couldn't believe so easily in his words. After all, that was the second day she had been a prisoner there, and she was in a foreign land, so it was common sense to be wary. Nevertheless, he replied that that common sense varied from culture to culture. He then said that perhaps she was afraid to go out, and that triggered her into accepting his proposal because she couldn't tarnish her pride as a knight, although she still felt tricked. He also told her that he had a hunch that she would like that land, but she didn't believe him, although when she finally went outside, she got flabbergasted with the beautiful landscape. In fact, she had to admit that that was a rich land, more beautiful than she ever expected. Vel then teased her saying that she was already being captivated by the land, but she immediately denied that. Shortly after, they were exploring and a dragon flied past them, which astonished Seraphina, who thought that was a terrifying sight. Nevertheless, Vel noticed her reaction and told her that although they considered dragons as legendary monster, for their people a dragon was just another animal. He even told her that they were indeed a tough hunt, but if you didn't approach their nest, they would leave you alone. Sometime later, they arrived to a waterfall that was the place he wanted to show her. Seraphina couldn't help but being impressed by that sight, because that was her first time seeing one. Vel then began to strip, and that shocked her. But he told her that there was one thing that a woman could do in a place like that. Obviously, Seraphina misunderstood his words and panicked, but that time he quickly clarified that he had meant they were going to take a bath. Of course, she told him that it was shameless for a man to bath together. but he replied that she should follow their customs since she was in their land. Our protagonist protested again, but in the end she complied and she, Cece, and Vel got naked and began to bath. In fact, Serafina ended up being completely seen by Vel, who then told her that he would be heading to a different stream. Serafina didn't like that he thought that she might escape and asked Cece how could she expose herself before a man so casually, to which Cece replied that it was a normal thing for her and also asked to not force an issue because she was protecting her instead of guarding her. Our protagonist asked her what she meant, but in that moment a monster appeared and Serafina ended up in a doggy-style position while being naked. Of course that freaked her out, but Cece told her that that monster was a kind of fish and that there were a lot of them nearby. Serafina then took a look around and noticed that they were surrounded by those fishes, so she decided to leave despite the warnings of Cece. Shortly after, she began to regret her decision because she was alone and naked. And to make things worse, she noticed that a man was nearby. Immediately thereafter, a very handsome young man appeared in front of her and she thought he was the Vela's nephew. Nevertheless, the important thing was that she found him truly handsome, but she still demanded him to stop staring at her. The young man then told her that she should be the warrior picked up by the future chieftain, and he guessed that she was bathing at the waterfall and a few beasts had surprised her. He then added that her mother was also from the west and that she had told him how amazed she was the first time she saw that land. After hearing that, she confirmed that the custom Vela had mentioned before was true, but before she could say anything she sneezed, so the young man gave her his coat to prevent her from catching a chill, and he then told her that he would escort her back to her clothes. That impressed her because the man in front of her was not only handsome but also a gentleman, something she hadn't expected to find in those barbaric lands. She then thought that perhaps Vela was an exception and began to lament having drawn a losing hand. The young man then noticed she had begun to tremble and that her face had turned red and got really close, thinking she had caught a cold. Right after, he princess carried her while she thought that although she wanted to resist, she couldn't. It was obvious that she liked the guy. Shortly after, they arrived in front of Cece, and the young man told her that he had found her lost in the woods, but Cece didn't follow his act and revealed he was Vela. That shocked Serafina, and Vela told her that it kind of hurt the soul that he had proposed to her and she couldn't even recognize him. He then teased her by saying that all it took for her to blush like a virgin was a quick trim of the beard. Immediately thereafter, she slapped him, saying that she was indeed a virgin. She then began to reprimand him for having taken her to the den of some monsters, but Cece and him said that they were just pets, which astonished her because their common sense was really something else. By the way, he had gotten impressed because her slap had hurt him despite she being in an unstable position. Serafina then told him that he forgave him because the scenery was quite pleasant, to which he replied that it was good to know that his wife had such a magnanimous heart. Of course, she asked him to not decide that on his own. In the end, she had to admit that he looked very good without the beard, but a few days later that beard was back and the charm broke. Serafina was surrounded of several warriors that wanted to fight with her and she didn't understand what was happening. Then a flashback started and took us 1 hour back where our protagonist was asking Vel if the meeting was ready. Apparently they were going to the base of Vela's clan because the elders of each clan had gone to see them. Not to mention that they were going to meet in Lake Village, which was the largest human settlement in that land. Of course, after hearing that, Serafina couldn't believe that he was showing her such an important place without any trouble, but he couldn't understand what she meant. She then explained that if she managed to escape, all the intel she had gathered would lead the barbarians to their doom. However, his reaction was not what she expected because he began to laugh out loud. That pissed her because she thought he believed that she would never be able to escape, but he explained that if she didn't want to go back, he wouldn't have to worry about it, and since he had said that she would be his wife, he would definitely make her fall in love with him. Moreover, she added that for her to show that concern, perhaps it meant that she had fallen in love with him at first sight, after seeing his real face. Of course, she denied his words and tried to refute him, but to no avail. Sometime later, they arrived to the village and met a lot of fully armed barbarian warriors. Back to the present, she thought that it was obvious and logical that those warriors wanted revenge. But Vel told her not to worry. Right after, he demanded those warriors to welcome Crystal Helmet. He even added that the priority in that moment was to greet the elders. Of course, that astonished her because she introduced her as someone strong and had asked the others to welcome her. However, that surprised her even more was that after hearing Vel's words, the other warriors immediately calmed down. She then asked him the purpose of that meeting, and he replied that they were there for health and to participate in a mock battle. She then said that it was normal for them to want revenge since they had a grudge against her. Nevertheless, he commanded the warriors who didn't have a grudge against Crystal Helmet to make way quickly, and everybody made way while saying that warriors born no grudge. That astonished Serafina, but she still followed Vel while thinking that she was not afraid to go anywhere, and that as a knight she knew that it was not easy to get rid of a grudge. In that moment, someone called her, but contrary to what she expected, he told her while crying that the battle she had had the other day had been the most beautiful things he had ever seen. Afterward, everyone began to praise her for having held her ground against Vel. Some even wished for her to give birth to a good and strong child. She just couldn't understand their behavior because they were not seeing her as their enemy, but Vel told her that they didn't hold grudges and that their value was that someone strong was also kind. Shortly after, the trio Cece was also with them, arrived to a tent, and Vel asked some women inside to give some hot water to Serafina and Cece. Right after, the women began to touch Serafina everywhere while saying that she looked like the big boss's wife and that her breasts were also well developed. Serafina tried to defend herself, but her struggle was useless against those women who were having their way with her. Even Cece didn't know what to do and Vel simply left. Shortly after, they were all inside the tent and the women were apologizing. Our protagonist in the end forgave them, and afterward they served her some tea. However, Serafina still demanded not to be called Vel's wife. Afterward, Serafina asked the women if in the barbarian lands it was a custom to share home with other families because those women had children and didn't look like relatives. Our protagonist also asked them if their husbands were on the front lines or if they were hunters, to which one of the women replied that their husbands had died a long time before when her child was still in her womb. Nevertheless, the worst part was that after hearing her story, Serafina realized that their husbands had been killed by her army. She then tried to convince herself that they had done that because it had been necessary and that she didn't need to get sentimental over the barbarians. But after hearing the little kid, she thought that as a knight that was not something you would say to a widow and a child. Serafina then told them that she would make no apologies for the lives lost in the conquest of her army, so they should resent her. She even added that she had been defeated and that they both had the right to avenge their husbands. However, one of the women asked why they should do that. That woman then explained that that was the way of a warrior. Of course, it was a pity that her child couldn't see his father's face, but she had been lucky to have seen him die, and above all, she was left with his child. In the end, women gave birth and raised the baby they loved, while men were destined to one day die in battle, so there was no need for Vel's wife to keep that anguish look on her face. After hearing those words, Serafina was really taken aback. She couldn't get why they thought that way, and it was in that moment when she began to accept that perhaps the barbarians had a completely different view of life and death. In that very moment, a whistle could be heard, which meant that they were under attack. Immediately thereafter, the tent where they were got destroyed, and Serafina knew that the attacked was not a single man. Right after, she looked around and saw a giant monster in front of her. At first, she thought it was a giant bird, but then she realized it was a dragon. Immediately thereafter, Seizi asked what was doing Tsukebikeshi there. She then explained that that was the name of that dragon and that they attacked the source of smoke when a fire was lit in the forest. However, she added that that attack was strange because the Tsukebikeshi from around there wouldn't attack their village since they had learned that if they did it, they would be hunted. Serafina then told the other women to evacuate, and they quickly replied that they would go to where the warriors were, as they usually did. Unfortunately, one of the kids cried in that moment and the dragon noticed them. Seizi then asked Serafina to run away because she wouldn't be able to face Velet if something happened to her, but our protagonist refused, saying that the barbarians took it too naturally that someone had to sacrifice themselves, and that was making her sick. Serafina then reminded Seizi that she was the first knight of the kingdom of Ildren. Right after, our protagonist parried the dragon's attack with a spear-like weapon she had taken out, and that astonished Seizi, because she noticed that Serafina had deflected Tsukebikeshi's beak with a pair of tongs. Nevertheless, our protagonist said that Seizi was distracting her, although after that first exchange she confirmed that a bird like that was nothing to be afraid of compared to that bearded man. Finally, she added that as long as there was someone weak behind her, she for her pride's sake would not retreat. The battle resumed, and after a couple of blows, Serafina managed to stab one of the dragon's eyes, which further astonished Seizi, because she was finally witnessing the true power of the woman who had clashed swords with Master Velet. However, our protagonist pulled Seizi out of her reverie by asking her to take the women out of there since she had gotten the dragon's attention. Seizi finally complied, but she begged Serafina to survive, to which she replied that if her opponent was on that level, there was no way she would lose. Seizi still couldn't believe her words, and Serafina told her that she would only be in her way, so she had to leave. Seizi finally began to leave, but she told our protagonist to just hold it back until someone went to help her. Shortly after, Seizi found Vela, who had just subdued 4 dragons, although he was aware that one was still missing. Seizi then informed him of what had happened, and he immediately rushed to help our protagonist. Back with Serafina, she had realized that the dragon was faster than her and that escaping wouldn't be easy, but continue the fight was not wise, and as if to prove her right, her weapon broke and she lost the upper hand. The dragon didn't miss that chance and went for the finishing blow. While Serafina thought that it was ironic that she had showed mercy to the weak after having invaded so many places, but with her sacrifice, she could finally say that she had lived and died like a knight. Nevertheless, in that moment, Vela asked her while screaming to cover her ears. She quickly obeyed, and he launched a powerful attack against the beast that blasted it into pieces. The attack was so powerful that it made a very characteristic sound, and that made Serafina understand why Vela was called Thunder Voice. Afterward, Vel formally thanked her as the next chief for risking her life to save the women and the children of the village. He then added that he was glad that she was fine, and when she looked at that gentle gaze of his, she realized something. Even though she had been knighted at 15 and had become the first knight at 19, even though she had fought for 7 years for her homeland in the Eastern Expedition, that had been the first time that someone had protected her, and in the end she couldn't help but cry. After the incident was solved, the village hosted a party, and Serafina was drinking a lot. Even Sissi warned her about it. However, our protagonist was trying to erase from her memory what had happened after the fight, because not only she had ended up crying, but Velet had princess carried her. That had been a huge blow for her pride. Although Sissi told her that after seeing her like that, she felt that she was easier to approach than before, not to mention that she was happy knowing that Serafina was the type of person that would fight for anyone's sake. As for Serafina, she said that she had done that only because it was a noble's duty, but then she thought that perhaps due to the alcohol, the unpleasant feeling from before had gone. She then recalled what had happened that day and couldn't help but think that he had been kinda cool when he protected her. Immediately thereafter, she tried to dismiss those thoughts but was interrupted because she began to hear voices of children that said that another one from Ildren had arrived, which was strange because because she hadn't felt them. She then turned around and saw a group of fairy-like creatures in front of her. Of course, she didn't recognize what they were, and in the end, she just thought that she was hallucinating due to the alcohol. However, shortly after, Vela appeared and confirmed that she was not seeing things. Serafina then asked him what they were, and he asked her to not be hasty and added that she was in for more surprises soon. Sometime later, she was in front of a lot of strange creatures that she didn't recognize. The only thing they had in common was that they all were anthropomorphic. In fact, she again thought that she was indeed hallucinating. Suddenly, a dwarf-like man called her and said that he hadn't thought that Vela would find a wife that quickly. He then added that it should have been thanks to the Great Spirit's guidance. She then asked him who he was, but the man simply offered her a sword as a gift, saying that she didn't need to be shy. Serafina knew that a sword was expensive and asked Vela what she should do, to which he replied that she should just take it because that guy made good swords. She was still not convinced, and the dwarf-like man asked to take a look at the blade before deciding. She did it and got astonished because the blade glowed faintly and had some symbols in it. The others smiled after hearing that and told her that they were the only ones who could make that using a special metal called mithril. After hearing that name, Serafina remembered those fantasy tales she had heard, and realized that the man in front of her should be a real dwarf, which further convinced her that she was either dreaming or hallucinating. In that moment, Vela interrupted her thoughts and told her that she knew that she was not dreaming, to which she replied that she was hearing a lot of new things even though she had been fighting in the war for 7 years. Vela then said that he understood what she was saying since those people had always deliberately kept their distance from the West. After hearing that, she asked him why they had appeared before her that day. After all, she was a knight of Ildren and also a noble, to which he replied that since he would be the next village chief, he thought he would introduce her to them. Right after, he did just that, and introduced her to Calculato, the master of logic of Ixt, who looked like an elf, Namhala, the outbreak of Kufwek, who looked like a dryad, Vamek, the great leader of Tefu, who looked like a fairy, and Vamek's subordinates Old Vas, Old Gwaz, and Old Balhath, the 3 old sages of Quift. By the way, Old Vas had been the one who had gifted her the sword. He then reminded her that he had told her that they were going to meet the chiefs of all clans. That was the purpose of that meeting, but well, she had forgotten that after the dragon's attack. Serafina then hit her forehead and said that she still couldn't believe that dragons from fairy tales had appeared in front of her. Vel then told her that even if she thought that they didn't exist, the truth was that they were there right in front of her. They were not from fairy tales, but their neighbors in that place. He then added that all of them had formed the Alliance of the 5 Great Tribes, and they were the arbitrators chosen by the Great Spirit through an ancient succession ritual. And finally, he added that when there was no emergency, they were just drinking buddies. They chiefs then revealed that they had sewed the dress she was wearing, and that the sword had been made because it had been requested by Vel. Even the potion from before was made by them. Serafina heard what they all said, and then suddenly asked what would happen if Ildren's armies attacked that place. However, all the chiefs began to laugh out loud, and told her that their alliance didn't get involved in territorial warfare, and that made her ask Vel if they meant that the war with Ildren was just like animal skirmishes, to which he replied that that should make sense to her since she had said that they were no different than beasts. She then asked why the alliance had been formed if they didn't get involved in territorial warfare. She even asked if their main purpose was to defend against the dragons. Nevertheless, they said they didn't need an alliance for that. But suddenly, the atmosphere became heavy. They then told her that there were some creatures that even the dragons feared, and that if she lived there, she would see them one day. Right after, the fairy told them to stop thinking about that and asked them to keep drinking. Sometime later, almost everybody was sleeping, and Serafina got close to Vela, who was sat alone. She then asked him if they could talk, and after noticing that she had sobered up, he replied that they indeed could. She then said that although it was too late to say it, she had realized that they really knew nothing about that land, yet they still fought. Or perhaps it was more accurate to say that to comes down, they all knew that the warriors in front of them also had families, but they just pretended to not notice. In fact, she was not ashamed to admit that calling them barbarians was just a justification for invading their land, but up to that moment she had believed it had been all for her people. That was why she had thought of him as an enemy that should be hated, but in that moment she had realized that they all were kind people. However, she reaffirmed that her wish to save her people from their suffering had not changed. In fact, she thought that if she took back some of the experience she had gained there, perhaps her wish would come true. That was why she honestly told her that she couldn't live up to his expectations. Nevertheless, Vele also reaffirmed that he was not giving up on her. Afterwards, she told him that those were her thoughts as a knight, but she then added, while blushing, that as a woman she liked him, to which he replied that he had confirmed that she was a sly woman with a face to match. The next day, Cecy went to awake Serafina, but they ended up clashing their heads in the process. Cecy then told our protagonist that the elders had all left, and since it was already noon, she had thought she would go wake her up. Serafina then began to recall what had happened the night before and started to have doubts about those mystical creatures, but she then took out her new sword and confirmed that everything had been real, which made her thought that there were still a lot of things she didn't know. She then began to analyze her sword and was amazed of how well it had been forged, not to mention it glow. She was really happy with it. In that moment, Vela appeared and told her that Old Vaz would be honored if he knew how much she liked the sword. Serafina quickly replied that the sword was a real gem, so they needed to give him something in return. But when she turned around to face him, she got speechless because he had shaved his beard. Shortly after, she regained her senses and asked him why he had shaved it, to which he replied that since it always grew very quickly, he didn't normally shave it, but because she had told him something very sweet sweet the night before, he had decided to do it. After hearing that, she began to recall all the things she had told him that night. And when she finally realized she had told him that she liked him, she quickly said that she had told him that because she was drunk. He then said that since she was drunk, then there was nothing he could do about it. Although it was a bit of a letdown. After all, when someone was drunk, they said things they didn't actually mean. Those words triggered Serafina, and she immediately asked him if he was implying that she was a shameless person who turned back in her word. Vel then tried to deny that, but she interrupted him, saying that what she had said the night before was undoubtedly her true feelings, so she wouldn't allow him to make fun of that, which ended up selling her completely and confirming that she truly liked him. Even Cece got the message. Afterwards, Cece and Vel kept teasing Serafina, but when our protagonist was about to protest, Cece fed her a sandwich made of the tsukobakeshi meat, and when Serafina learned that fact, she immediately asked for another one. Afterwards, she told Vel that she had already made up her mind the night before. She would learn about every single detail of that land, and then she would take the best of foreign cultures back to her homeland. After hearing that, Vel asked Serafina if she didn't mind they took a little walk and added that there was someone who wanted to meet her. He even added that if she wanted to learn about that land, she might as well start off learning from her senior, since it was more motivating to meet someone you knew. Obviously, those words puzzled her, and she began to wonder who could be that person. Sometime later, they arrived to a house, and there was a pregnant woman waiting for them there. After seeing her, Vel told her that she could have waited for them inside, to which she replied that she had gotten a bit too excited. The woman then looked at our protagonist and told her that it had been really a long time. She then added that she had heard she had protected a mother and a child from a dragon attack, and that she had missed that brave spirit of her. However, after a little while, Serafina asked her who she was, to which the woman replied that although her appearance had changed a lot, she was Naira, a knight in the Eastern Expedition 4 years before. Obviously, that triggered the memories in Serafina's mind, and she finally remembered that she was her former subordinate from the House of Fromar. Of course, she had changed a lot, and one of the biggest changes was a huge scar she currently had in her left eye, which was permanently closed. Nevertheless, our protagonist noticed another thing and immediately asked if she was pregnant, to which Naira replied that that was her second child. That astonished Serafina, who then said that there was so much going on to the point that she couldn't keep her head straight. Naira then invited them to talk inside the house. Shortly after, Naira told Serafina that the night before her husband had mentioned the crystal helmet, and she had remembered that our protagonist was the only one with a crystal helmet in the army. After hearing those words, Serafina realized another thing and quickly asked her if she really had a husband. Naira then replied that the man who defeated her asked her to marry him, and she added that she had settled in there already. She even said that it felt unreal, as if she was living life like another person. They then began to talk about the customs there, and one thing led to the other, and eventually Serafina found out that Vela was actually 18 years old, which meant that she was older than him. That shocked her, but before she could think of anything else, Vela added that Naira was his brother's wife. They then began to recall what had happened when Naira arrived to the village, but Serafina was still focused on the fact that Vela was 18 years old. Naira then said that Serafina was 26, and Vela simply added that their ages didn't matter because they were both in their prime. Although he also said that he would have wanted to be older so he could take her to his village earlier, to which she replied that perhaps she could have beat him in that scenario, and they all ended up laughing. Nevertheless, Vela apologized to Serafina for her rudeness towards her as a warrior. That made Stacey ask Naira why Vela had done that, and Naira explained that Vela had beaten Serafina because he was stronger, but mainly because her sword failed her. That was why it was logical to say that with a better weapon she could have defeated him. Of course, he also didn't use his Thunder Howl, but the point was that it was rude from him to assume he would win if their battle could be repeated. He even admitted that with a little more power she might have beaten him. He then apologized to her again and added that he was glad he had defeated her, and thanked her for the happiness she had granted him. After hearing that, Serafina, though, while blushing that it was not fair that he could say stuff like that. Naira then said that although Serafina had told Vela she liked him, she still couldn't be honest with herself, to which Stacey added that she was a pain in the ass. Afterward, our protagonist told them that they both weren't even trying to hold back anymore. They kept on teasing each other, and sometime later Naira's husband arrived, and while they were all greeting each other, Serafina began to recall some moments when Naira had told her that she would dedicate her life to kill barbarians, which made her realize that her friend had indeed changed a lot. However, she also realized that the current Naira looked so much happier, to the point that her resolution to not get married began to waver. Several days had passed since the events at the lakeside village, so it had been more than 10 days since Serafina had been taken there by Vel, and our protagonist was training with her new sword while cutting firewood. Shortly after, Ceci arrived and told her that it was enough for that day. In fact, she pointed out that in the last 3 days, our protagonist had cut enough firewood for 2 weeks. Serafina then replied that just eating and sleeping every day weakened the body, and that it was natural to want to get used to a big sword. Ceci then asked her if she had been suspiciously approaching her the last 2 days because she was bored, to which our protagonist replied that after settling in Say, ended up having too much time on her hands with nothing to do. In that moment, Ceci told her that that morning Vela had left the village because he had come up with an ingenious idea to solve Sarah's frustration, which obviously picked up our protagonist's curiosity. Immediately thereafter, both of them noticed that there was a group of warriors walking towards them from the village, and the one leading them was Vela. Once they got closer, Vela finally revealed his idea and told Serafina that since she was not busy, she should take on the village warriors. However, contrary to Ceci's expectation, our protagonist got excited with the idea, although she tried to hide it, and accepted the offer. Vela then asked Ceci to give Sarah her armor, and the two women went to get ready. Serafina got surprised after realizing that Ceci had kept her armor in a corner of the room, but the other replied that from the beginning her intention had been to form a friendly relationship with her, although she apologized because she had given very little maintenance to the armor. Once Serafina saw her armor again, she immediately noticed the helmet and decided that she wouldn't be wearing it, and that she would borrow a shield from someone. Afterwards, Ceci helped our protagonist to put on the armor, and once they finished, Serafina couldn't help but think that wearing it after that long felt great. Shortly after, they both returned to where Vela and the other warriors were. Afterwards, Serafina told them that she would kill time with all of them, and the warriors got excited since they were about to fight Crystal Helmet. Her first opponent was a young warrior who had fought for the first time in the last battle, the Gamelan warrior boy of the Blue Fang Laham. It was decided that Vela would act as the referee, and shortly after, the first match began. Unfortunately for the young warrior, he got defeated almost immediately, and then the Gamelan of the Blue Fang himself decided to settle the score, which made him the second challenger. Sadly, shortly after, both father and son ended up defeated. Those two matches impressed the other warriors, who finally confirmed that Serafina was really a skilled warrior. The third opponent was Zero of the Two Heads, and the fourth one was the Gaz warrior. Nevertheless, they didn't stand a chance, and that impressed Ceci a lot. In fact, in that moment, Vumek got close to her and told her that Ildren was known for its willpower. The fairy then explained that willpower was a strong desire to accomplish something. Birds could fly, fish could swim, dragons could be strong, and fairies could exist for the same reason. She also said that for warriors like our protagonist, their will to protect made their skills grow and their strength increase. Plus, they infused their willpower into their weapon. That was why it was difficult to destroy a weapon full of willpower by means that were not full of willpower. Not to mention that, unlike mystical creatures like her and the other leaders, warriors like Serafina had short lives, so they didn't have enough time to do what they wanted to do. Thus, they had a strong will to do something in their short life. Sometime later, the most anticipated fight began, and it was a rematch between Serafina and Vel, although the mood was different. However, Vel told her that he didn't have any weapon advantage, so he would be able to practice with someone more skilled than him. Immediately thereafter, their second duel began. The battle was very tough because both of them managed to keep the other's pace, but Serafina quickly realized that he had cornered her, so she wouldn't be able to shield or deflect his next move in time. So she decided to break his blade. Her strategy worked partially because although she managed to break Vel's blade, her own blade ended up broken too. And since both wooden swords couldn't be used anymore, their match was declared a draw. Vel then asked her if she had managed to kill some time, to which our protagonist replied that she felt totally refreshed. Meanwhile, in another place, a group of people were walking, and a nun among them was saying that the barbarians were annoying. They didn't know the wrath of God, had repeatedly resisted the sacred task of the Eastern expedition, and had kidnapped the heroine who had led the longest Eastern expedition in history. In that moment, one of the warriors told the woman, who was a priestess called Marcius, that a few days before they had been attacked by a strange bird, so he thought that they should replenish their supplies first, or their lives could be in danger. Nevertheless, she replied that Serafina's life was more important than theirs. She then added that if any of them were to return home, they would inevitably suffer the wrath of the royal family. Finally, she reminded them that there was only one way to fix that problem, and that was to rescue Miss Serafina de la Valente. Vel and his men were hunting a dragon, and Serafina was also with them. In fact, during the battle, he said everything so she could land the finishing blow to the beast. However, she ended up being pushed away, but fortunately Vele managed to catch her, although she began to wonder why she was accompanying those warriors. She then recalled that it all had begun that morning when a messenger arrived from the village, saying that wounded dragons were appearing in the western forest. Moreover, their wounds didn't look like they had been caused by other dragons. In fact, their wounds seemed to have been caused by humans. However, Vele thought that that was strange, since letting them go wounded was not the kind of thing a clan living on that land would do. Not to mention that he had also realized that since the messenger had gone to him, it was almost certain that those wounds had probably been made by a beast. The messenger then confirmed his assumption and told him that the Tefus had appeared and had warned them, saying that they had seen a huge wounded dragon in the forest. That surprised Vele, since he was aware that the Tefus were the manifestation of the will of nature, so they appearing was no ordinary event. He then decided to hunt that dragon and asked Serafina if she wanted to go with them, to which she replied that she was more than willing to go, which surprised Seshi since our protagonist had been cautious of the dragons at first. The group then departed, and sometime later they had managed to lure the giant dragon towards their traps and defeated it. In that moment, Vele pulled her out of her reverie and explained her that that giant dragon was a real one since it had 6 legs. In fact, the center pair were the remains of its wings. He also told her that there was an even more dangerous dragon called Fire Dragon that sometimes appeared in the mountains. Nevertheless, the issue at hand in that moment was to determine who had wounded that giant dragon. Right after, the messenger called them and showed them a strange injury the dragon had on one of its front legs. It was a pretty deep burn, but there were no soot marks, so it wasn't just fire. Vel then said that it looked similar to the logic art used by the Ifict. However, he also knew that they would never hurt dragons but always made sure to finish them. In the end, Vel guessed that the culprit was probably some kind of sorcerer from the west and asked Sarah if she had any idea who it could be. Our protagonist then began to consider the matter, and an idea came to her mind, but she couldn't believe it. Vel asked her what she had thought, and she revealed that in the West there were rumors of those with incomprehensible power. They handled the miracles of light in their official religion, the priests of the Common Era order. In that moment, Vumek appeared literally, since she could manifest wherever the wind could reach, and informed them that they had found them. Apparently, there were some idiots who were using logic art without catalysts in the eastern forest, which meant that soon the sediment would form. That sediment thing astonished Vel, who asked if they were out of their minds. Afterward, he ordered some of his men to dismember the dragon, and told the rest to go back to the village and prepare for the worst. Finally, he ordered the warriors who had nicknames to follow him. Of course, Seraphina noticed how nervous was Vel and asked him what was the sediment. Right after, he told her that the sediment was what blocked the flow of logic. He then explained that going against logic made you a demon, and added that the sediment was the demon. Immediately thereafter, Vel and the others followed Vumek, and during the route they saw several corpses of the Night Corps of the Eastern Army, and a lot of small dragons. Shortly after, they managed to find the enemy, and it ended up being Priestess Marcius. Obviously, the priestess recognized Sarah immediately, and Vel asked our protagonist if she knew her, to which she replied that she was a member of the Knight's First Order that was led by her. Seraphina then added that she was a fanatic, so it would be tough to interact with her. Not to mention that Vel didn't approve how she was treating the forest and its creatures. On the other hand, Marcius recognized Vel as a barbarian and told Sarah they had to kill him. Our protagonist then asked the priestess to calm down and talk, but the other didn't listen. In fact, Marcius assumed Sarah had been raped and had ended up betraying her homeland. Seraphina tried to clear the misunderstanding, but to no avail, and even Vel tried to solve things by talking. Sadly, the priestess began to cast a spell and attacked Vel and his men. Nevertheless, Vel managed to block all the arrows of light that the priestess casted and told her that she would need a sword to cut off his head. That pissed off Marcius because he was not showing respect to the miracle God had given him. Afterwards, she began to cast another spell, and Vel tried to warn her about what she was about to provoke. Unfortunately, Marcius mistook that as he asking for mercy and replied that it was useless to beg for his life. What Marcius didn't notice was that the willpower of the earth was withering away, and finally Vel told Sarah that the priestess could no longer be saved. In that moment, some dark creatures began to appear beneath Marcius and started to grab her. Sarah's first reaction after seeing that was trying to help her out of duty since she was a fellow countrywoman, but Vel stopped her, saying it was too late since the sediment had sprouted demons. It was at that moment that Marcius finally realized she was in big trouble, but there was nothing she could do. On the other hand, Vali told Sarah that he would kill the priestess since the demon was still taking shape with that woman as its core, so they couldn't afford to miss that opportunity. Not to mention that that thing corrupted and devoured the victim's mind. Thus, if they killed her in that moment, she could still die as a human. However, another warrior arrived and tried to attack the monster that was holding Marcius, but it was useless. In fact, the creature killed that warrior and a comrade of his. Afterward, the demon began to eat the priestess, and Vali decided he couldn't waste more time, so he decided to start the attack. Unfortunately, when he was about to issue the command, Sarah apologized and left his side. Our protagonist was aware that Veli and the rest had no duty to help Marcius, but 2 people had already died while she was hesitating, so she decided to act following her honor as a knight. Shortly after, she managed to arrive very close to the priestess, who was already naked and had almost lost consciousness. However, before she could rescue the woman, the creature attacked. Luckily, Veli arrived on time and managed to protect Seraphina by using the thunderclap. Our protagonist then asked him not to stop her, to which Veli replied that he wouldn't do it. In fact, he and his men were going to help her, although the chances of success were slim. That surprised Seraphina. Veli said that she could think of it as repayment for having risked her life during the dragon incident. He then explained the strategy. The other warriors would act as decoys to create a breach, and he would use thunderclap again, which would expose the core of the sediment. Immediately thereafter, the plan was set in motion, and shortly after, the core was indeed exposed. However, Sarah was confused because the figure in front of her didn't look like Marcius. It looked like a harpy, or perhaps an angel. Nevertheless, she managed to quickly regain her senses and pierced through it with her sword. An explosion occurred right after, and the creature got destroyed. Afterward, Marcius fell and her head hit Seraphina's head, but both of them were fine. However, Marcius got arrested and was sent to prison. The barbarians even took away her spellbook and talisman. Sometime later, Vele, Saci, and Sarah went to visit her, and of course when Marcius saw Vele, she screamed he was going to rape her, subdue her, and kill her. She then threatened him with divine punishment if he assaulted her and demanded him to give her back her spellbook and talisman. Nevertheless, Vele and Saci tried very politely to talk with the priestess, but Marcius said that she would only talk to Seraphina. Right after, she begged our protagonist to bring that barbarian to justice. In that moment, Vele asked Sarah to proceed as planned, but our protagonist didn't react because she was way too embarrassed after realizing she had behaved exactly like that when she first met Vele after being defeated by him and captured, although pointed out that Sarah was cuter. Of course, Marcius noticed that Sarah was being friendly with the barbarians and asked her why she was behaving like that. Our protagonist then replied that she would explain everything, and right after, she solemnly swore that she no longer intended to kill the barbarians, which startled the priestess. Marsyas told her that she was making no sense, but Seraphina refuted her, saying that since she had gotten there, she had realized there were many more things she had yet to understand, so she had decided to stay there until she figured them out. She then added that although the priestess might not remember, she had asked for help and they had helped her. Finally, our protagonist reminded her that she would be going against Colmenare's teachings if she returned a favor with malice. After hearing that, Marsyas got shocked and said that while that was indeed true, applying that on a bunch of heretics made no sense for her, and the priestess finally broke and began to cry. Marsyas then said that they had completely corrupted Seraphina because the woman she used to be would have never said a thing like that. Afterwards, she started to cry out loud since her idol had just crumbled in front of her. Of course, Cecy and Vel asked our protagonist why the priestess was behaving like that, and Seraphina explained that Marsyas had always been emotionally unstable and tended to consider her as a sacred knight. In that moment, Marsyas noticed how Seraphina was dressed and thought our protagonist had been made a sex slave since her armor had some openings that exposed her chest and thighs, and she was wearing a collar. Sadly, before Seraphina could clear the misunderstanding, the priestess told her that she was the princess, master of the Eastern Expedition, and heir to the throne. Then she asked her what would the martyr of the 16th Eastern Expedition 20 years ago, Miss Wisteria, think if she saw her in that moment. That touched a weak spot on Seraphina, but before she could say anything, Vel said that he didn't know Wisteria was still known, although he understood that after 20 years of being missing it made sense to think she was dead. Those words disgusted Marsyas because she was talking about her extremely casually, and she was the tragic princess who had been martyred for her sacred task in the Eastern Expedition. She even asked what he knew about the Durish who had been canonized by the Order of Colmenera. Nevertheless, Vel didn't bat an eyelid and replied that if they wanted to see her they could. He could even call her over there, if they preferred that. Obviously that shocked both Marsyas and Seraphina, while Sessa began to smile thinking a good show was about to begin. And she was very right, because right after Vel revealed that Wisteria was her mother. Of course that revelation took aback Marsyas and Seraphina, but shortly after our protagonist regained her senses and said that it made sense considering Vela's strength and appearance. However, the priestess was still shocked, and couldn't make sense of any of that. In fact, she told Sarah that Vela was trying to deceive them. Nevertheless, our protagonist replied that perhaps not so long before she would have thought the same as the priestess. But in that moment she was aware that the warriors of those lands had been courting female knights for generations. And to prove her point, she revealed that Naira, who they thought died 4 years before, had a family there. Not to mention that Vela had proposed to her. The priestess couldn't believe what the other had said. And to add insult to injury, she noticed that Sarah seemed slightly pleased about the proposal, although our protagonist tried to deny it. However, Seraphina quickly added that it was pointless for Vela to tell them a lie that would be so easy to find out. After all, he had gone to search for Wisteria, and since our protagonist knew her face, it didn't make sense to lie about it. With those words, Sarah finally managed to convince Marsyas, and right after she began to recall the moments she had spent with her big sister Wisteria, which made her feel nostalgic. After all, she had lost her mother very soon, so for Sarah, Wisteria was her sister, her mother, and the knight she longed to be. Vel then pulled her out of her reverie because not only he returned in that moment, but also he had shaved, and Sarah was still having troubles handling the impact that change had on her. Moreover, the priestess got astonished after seeing him like that and being informed that he was 5 years younger than her. She even said that he was a wild, pretty boy. Vel then called her mother, and Wisteria entered the place while saying that as the wife of the great chieftain of those lands, and as a former princess of Ildren, she welcomed the visitors from her homeland. Furthermore, the woman released her willpower, which made both Sarah and Marsyas feel a huge pressure. In fact, our protagonist admitted that it had sent a shiver down her spine, which confirmed the woman in question was stronger than a high knight. Wisteria then said that she had learned much of Sarah's military fame from her son and warriors, but our protagonist thought that something didn't add up because her sister would have never spoken to her so formally like a stranger. And as to prove Sarah right, Wisteria almost immediately dropped the act and began to speak very informally. Right after, Vel reprimanded her saying it had been too much, and even Cecy added that she had gotten scared. Of course, that crushed Sarah's doubts and she quickly went to hug her big sister, while crying out loud, and Wisteria didn't miss that chance to grope our protagonist's body, which made her remember that she also behaved like that in the past. In fact, Wisteria had lived her life in an odd way when compared to other female nobles. When she was 14, she broke off her engagement by defeating her fiancé in a direct confrontation and conferred a title of nobility on herself, going against the rules. Afterwards, she kicked out all the bandits, thieves, and drug dealers who were inside Ildren in conjunction with the princess's royal guard. Furthermore, she sent traitors of the motherland who had worked for foreigners to court, sentenced them to death, cut off and exposed to the public the heads of corrupt governors, and so on, thus receiving great support from the people. Finally, she led the 16th Eastern Expedition. Vel finally had enough and asked her mom to let Sarah go, But Wistarizia wouldn't listen and even asked her little sister if she had had sex with Vel. Of course, our protagonist quickly stated that she was virgin in body and soul, and Wistarizia mocked her son, saying he was keeping Serafina without even touching her at all. In that moment, Marsyas mustered her courage and asked Sarah's sister if she was Saint Wistarizia, to which the other replied by asking the priestess if she was part of the Comanera order, although she quickly added that being a saint was useless to her. Immediately thereafter, Wistarizia asked Sarah if she had taken off the necklace Velid had given to her. That question surprised our protagonist since she thought the collar had to be magically removed since it didn't have attachment points. And she was no wrong, the necklace was an enchanted item. It had a mechanism to come off by itself if the person didn't want it, which meant that Sarah was somehow willing to accept Vela's proposal since the collar was an engagement necklace. Obviously, that took Sarah aback since she thought that an engagement item should be a ring, but for Vela's people a ring could be lost if a dragon just ate their limbs, so if it was on their heads, they would have to lose their heads to lose it. Right after, Wistarizia began to explain how the barbarians' culture had evolved along the years and how the tradition of warriors marrying knights was established. She even told her sister that no one could criticize her for being honest with herself. Serafina then said that she believed she should look out for the happiness of the people in Lavaland, but Wistarizia asked her how she could pretend to make others happy if she didn't even know what made her happy. In the end, if she fell in love, she should stay with him, and if she didn't like him, she should leave him. Those words made Serafina to rethink her beliefs, but Wistarizia kept pressing her sister and asked her if she could put the necklace back on, and added that it was not an easy task to do it because she had to willingly take an oath. Vel then tried to dissuade her mother from telling all the secrets related to the collar to Sarah, but it was in vain, and the young man ended up asking our protagonist if she really wanted to wear it, to which Serafina replied that she didn't hate the idea, which made Vel happy. He then swore the oath and formally declared his love for her. The necklace reacted and ended up in Sarah's neck. As for Sarah, she showed no reaction at all since she was completely shocked after hearing his confession of love. Sometime later, Serafina was thinking about all the things that had happened with her sister and couldn't help but think about the necklace. After all, it had a spell that made it removable if you dislike it, so the wearer had no choice but to be honest with their feelings. Afterward, she recalled how her brother and her grandfather would set up marriage matches for her every time she did her annual reports on the Eastern Expedition. And what was worse were the candidates themselves. They were a bunch of sons of noble families with an arrogant attitude just because they were from high-status families who pretended to change her just because she was a woman, even though she was a knight with combat and leadership skills. Nevertheless, Vel pulled her out of her reverie by asking her if something was bothering her, which led her to accept that he was not just handsome, but he had also given her a fair assessment of her abilities as a knight. Not to mention that despite being younger than her, he looked mature and have guts, and then she noticed that she was having weird feelings but didn't know the cause. This time it was Wistarizia who pulled Sarah out of her reverie by telling her that it was called a woman's heart. Obviously, that embarrassed our protagonist, who immediately began to fight with her sister. Shortly after, Cecy decided to let Wistarizia know that Marsyas had fallen into an endless spiral of depression. After all, the priestess couldn't accept how her idols just kept crumbling right before her eyes. Sarah's sister couldn't help but feel sorry for her and asked Cecy to untie her. Sometime later, the group returned to the village, and a crowd of kids went straight to our protagonist because they considered her their hero. Wistarizia then explained to her sister that that was a village where warriors lived hunting dragons, so it was no surprise those children would look up to someone who had just slayed a dragon, not to mention that she had killed a demon too. It was in that moment when a sudden realization hit her. In those lands, everybody should live by being strong, so even if she was a woman, as long as she was strong, they wouldn't see her any differently. Shortly after, they met one of the ladies who attended our protagonist when she first arrived to the village, and she happily greeted them. She even called Sarah wife of Mr. Voice of Thunder, which of course embarrassed our protagonist. Unfortunately for Serafina, the young woman took that as if she was finally officially engaged with Vela and decided to tell everybody the good news, without giving Sarah time to clear the misunderstanding. Afterwards, Zero of the two heads arrived without his helmet, which surprised our protagonist, and she explained that since she had saved his sister and nephew, he had thought that he had to repay her the life debt with another life or he couldn't show himself in front of her as a warrior. So after helping her save the stupid priestess, he could finally take off his helmet. Obviously, Marsyas didn't like being called stupid, but everybody agreed that he had behaved that way, so she had no choice but to endure. Zero then said that Marsyas's mental state had changed a lot compared to when she was in the forest, which meant she had already gone through the purification ceremony. Those words caught Sierra's attention, but immediately thereafter, the warrior added that that night would be held a festival to honor her and the warriors who had fought with her. Later that night, everybody was celebrating, but what impressed Sierra the most was seeing the skull of the dragon they had killed being placed in an altar to be revered. After all, in the West it would be an abhorrent death figure, but the barbarians used its flesh to feed the people and showed respect to its remains. In fact, she even went as far as to thank that totem for the food, which was delicious by the way. Sierra was enjoying the food so much that her sister offered her a glass wine which was brewed by the marsh fairies with their special grains. After some hesitation, our protagonist drank the wine, and right after she got elated by its taste, to the point where Marsyas thought the knight had been drugged. Speaking of the priestess, she was still refusing to eat anything out of stubbornness, but Cecy managed to convince her that her attitude was just pitiful. After all, she had been lucky that because of Sierra's help supported by the other warriors, her life had one more chance. Marsyas also thought that the meat was delicious, but that taste reminded her that all the knights that she was leading had died because she had told them they had to rescue Sierra. She was convinced that everything was going to work out for them, but in the end she was the only survivor. However, Seed reprimanded her for thinking like that. After all the knights knew that they could die in that mission, so she should be happy of having survived. On the other hand, Vela was waking up Serafina, who was under the effect of the wine, and when she sobered up a little, he told her that the next day the League of the Tribes would gather to perform the Great Purification Ceremony, so he would reveal to her a part of the mysteries hidden within that land. That night, Sarah had a strange dream about she being underwater and seeing a weird dragon who talked to her in an unknown language. However, before she could think of anything else, Vumek asked her to move because our protagonist was crushing her. It seemed they both had slept in the same bed. Right after, Naira arrived and told our protagonist that all of the 5 great clans had gathered in the village that morning, which made Sarah wonder if they did that every time a demon appeared. After all, despite having gotten used to dragons, she was still unfamiliar with the fairies. Unfortunately, she then tried to recall the details of the dream she had just had, but she couldn't remember anything of it. Sometime later, the people from the 5 great clans were walking towards a location while saying it was good they had defeated the settlement so quickly because it was much easier to prepare and clean up after the Great Purification when it was still in its cocoon. Moreover, they all were aware that it had been thanks to Serafina. Obviously, our protagonist thought it was amazing how fast they had learned about it, and Vumek explained that it had been thanks to the fairies. After she defeated the demon, Serafina had fainted because she hit her head with Marcias, and while she was unconscious, the fairies spread the news. As for the priestess, well, she was feeling the same shock our protagonist had felt when she found out that the elves, dwarfs, and fairies, among other mystical creatures from fairy tales, were real. In fact, in that moment, a fairy was shamelessly on top of her head laughing out loud, so she couldn't help but wonder why she had been invited to a ritual of inhumans and barbarians. Right after, Sacy, who seemed to have read Marcias's mind, replied her that even she was against the idea, but Wistaria had said that since the priestess was the cause of the sediment, she should be taken with them too. That surprised Marcias, but even then she still couldn't accept the existence of the fairies. Nevertheless, right after the whole group arrived to the place where Saracia and the other had fought the demon, and noticed that the entire area had turned into white dust. Vel then explained that the willpower of life once lost couldn't be regained. On the other hand, the willpower of events settled, stagnated, forgot what it was, and became dust. Afterward, Kalka interrupted him, saying that he would explain the details, but before he needed the codex from the priestess. Marcias, after seeing her codex, demanded them to give it back to her, but she was ignored. Right after, Kalka took a look of it, and after understanding its principles, he said it was lame to use the logic art for destruction, especially because even without wearing an armor, they could think of ways to counter those type of attacks easily. He then added that it was time to start the ritual to wake up the earth. In the end, the Great Purification was a ritual where all the clans inflamed catalysts of all the elements by a ritual of prayer, thus reminding them of their existence. The ritual began with Vela at the center, and Kalka started to pray in an ancient language that Sarah couldn't understand. After all, she had heard that prayer had been passed down from generation to generation tens of thousands of years before. Once the prayer ended, Vela stabbed the soil with his sword, and a magical event happened that startled Serafina, Marcias, and even Ceci. In fact, our protagonist was so touched after seeing how the earth recovered its vitality that she ended up crying, while thinking that she understood a little bit more the relationship between nature and the people of those lands. Sometime later, our protagonist was planting trees in that area, and Vela told her that she seemed to be curious about what was going on. To which Sarah replied that she hadn't thought replanting the forest would be their job as well. Vela then said that healing the forest was also their job. After all, if the Tribal League didn't do it, the forest would disappear, so their children, their grandchildren, and many more people would cry. He also added that the desire to only enjoy the present without thinking of others to come was the great source of the sediment, because demons were the very form of selfishness. Sarah then asked Tukalka what would happen if a person was absorbed by the sediment, and the other replied that the person would get a new personality and memories. He also added that there were rare cases in which people were saved before they were completely absorbed, which would normally leave them invalid. So in such instances, it was customary to use the rite of purification on them. Immediately thereafter, Vela called Marcias and asked her about her past, which made both she and Serafina realize that the priestess had lost almost all her memories prior her 16th birthday. However, despite paying a huge price, our protagonist thought that Marcias had been lucky to have survived the incident with the demon.